Hi everyone, welcome to the final lecture of the biogeochemistry section. We're going to be talking about the carbon cycle and we're going to be linking the energy cycle and the water cycle to the carbon cycle. So again, we're going to be talking about how all of these cycles are linked. We're actually going to bring in the nitrogen cycle as well. So by now you ought to be quite comfortable with all of the concepts and all of the systems thinking. So we're going to try to extend it and make you think about implications and what this all means. At its most basic, life and life on Earth is about energy. The way things grow, the way plants grow, is that energy from sunlight is used to take carbon dioxide and water molecules and to combine them into a high energy organic carbon molecule, usually glucose, and in the process, oxygen is emitted. So photosynthesis transfers electrons from water to energy-poor carbon dioxide molecules, and in the process they create energy-rich sugars. But photosynthesis needs energy to do this, and the energy comes from light. So the light energy drives the electrons from the water, and that's how solar energy is converted into chemical energy. Glucose, this organic energy-rich carbon molecule, is a form of stored energy. We all know that. When you drink a non-diet Coca-Cola, you are accessing the energy that a corn plant captured from the sun, turned into glucose and then into fructose, which a manufacturing company then turned into high fructose corn syrup and put into the can of Coke. That's why you get energy when you drink Coke. Now, there is only one pathway by which energy can come into the system, and that's photosynthesis, and I talked to you about that in the previous slide. But there are many pathways by which energy is released again, from microbes decomposing organic matter, to animals eating plants, to fires burning biomass and releasing energy, and even to people burning coal or oil and releasing energy. So these are all different pathways by which energy can be released so that the organic carbon gets turned back into carbon dioxide again, and in the process, energy is released. This slide is just a refresher from the biogeochemistry lecture, and it should be totally familiar to you now that you've been systems ecologists for almost 2 weeks. So I'm just going to go through it step by step. In order to understand how energy or carbon, when we talk about organic carbon, we're actually talking about energy. So we can talk about how energy moves through the carbon cycle or how carbon moves through the carbon cycle. In order to understand that, we need to understand the difference between a stock or a pool and a flux or a flow. When carbon or energy is stored in a physical location, it is part of a stock. So inside a tree, in the atmosphere, or in the soil. When carbon or energy is moving between any of these locations, it is a flux. And for the rest of this lecture, we'll talk about what drives the carbon cycle. What drives the fluxes of carbon through the system? Here is a systems diagram of the carbon cycle. You can see it's not boxes and arrows. There's a few arrows, but it's actually pictures. There's pictures of trees, there's pictures of soil, there's pictures of clouds, there's pictures of the sky, but it is a systems diagram. And all the different stocks and fluxes in the systems diagram are labeled. So I would like you to take a minute before moving on to the next slide to write down which of the things labeled in this image are stocks and which are fluxes. Have a look at all of these words and think about if it's a stock or a flux, and look at the numbers that are associated with it. Okay, I'm sure you got it all right. The stocks or the pools are plant biomass. So sometimes this is separated into above ground and below ground pools, so anything to do with plants. Soil carbon, which is also called soil organic matter. Fossil carbon, which is just very, very old and not decomposed soil carbon, like coal and oil. And then the atmosphere is also a stock, because that's where the carbon is stored. The fluxes, well, you've got photosynthesis, you've got plant respiration, you've got microbial respiration, And you've got animal respiration, and you've got combustion or burning of the carbon. So just to recap, when carbon or energy is stored in a physical location, like inside a tree as biomass, or in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or in the soil as humus, it is part of a stock. When carbon or energy is moving between any of these locations, it's a flux. Remember, stocks are measured in biomass per unit area. So when we were in our vegetation prac, we were measuring the amount of carbon in the trees, biomass per unit area, and fluxes are measured in biomass per unit area per unit time. In this graph, the values for the stocks are in brackets, so that was a good tip, and the values for the fluxes are not in brackets. But you can notice that the fluxes are generally much, much less than the stocks. So there's much less carbon moving between any of the stocks than there is stored in any of the stocks. Then there's one other concept I want you to understand in this graph, and that's the idea of a source and a sink. A sink is a process whereby carbon is removed from the atmosphere, and a source is a process whereby carbon is released into the atmosphere. So notice how many different sources there are. Plant respiration, microbial respiration, combustion, all these arrows out, but only one sink, and the sink in the terrestrial carbon cycle is photosynthesis. By now, you will have realized that photosynthesis is a pretty important process. It also can be called primary productivity. So we're going to talk a little bit about this is the input to the terrestrial carbon cycle, and we're going to discuss this input and understand it. Now, one thing you need to realize is that plants are not actually that efficient at taking energy and turning it into carbon. Most plants have a photosynthetic efficiency between 1 and 8%. In comparison, solar panels can convert light into electrical energy with an efficiency of about 6 to 20%. It can even be above 40%. I find this quite astounding, that we as human beings in our brief time on Earth have managed to find a more efficient way to store light energy than plants have over their millions of years of evolution. I gave you that slide before and told you about how plants aren't very efficient, just so that you understand that there are a lot of factors that limit productivity or limit photosynthesis. In terrestrial communities, potential productivity is set by the amount of available solar radiation. So that's, the amount of energy coming in is how the potential amount that could be photosynthesized. But actual productivity depends on all sorts of things. It depends on having available water and available atmospheric CO2, because you remember the equation in the first slide? To capture carbon, you need atmospheric CO2 and water. It requires appropriate temperatures. Low temperatures slow down photosynthetic rates, but too high temperatures can also cause problems with the photosynthetic machinery. And then it also depends on soil nutrients. Nutrients being limiting can prevent efficient photosynthesis. In aquatic communities, nutrients and light are generally the most limiting because there's plenty of water and CO2 in aquatic communities. So let's talk a little bit about the water. Water is probably the most important controller of primary production. As you remember from the water cycle, plants have to use water to take up carbon dioxide because they all go through the stomates. So if the stomates are closed, they don't lose water, but they can't take up carbon dioxide. So the more water they have, the more they can photosynthesize. This is a graph that shows the patterns that I explained in words in the previous slide. It's quite a tricky slide to read because it actually has 3 axes. It shows how net primary productivity, the total amount of carbon that plants can fix per hectare per year, is affected by both temperature and precipitation. So the response variable, you guys are drawing graphs for your pracs at the moment, and I asked the TAs to explain to you the difference between a response variable and an effect variable, or we use words like the driver and the response, So the response variable here is net primary production. And the predictor variables are temperature and precipitation. If you look at the graph carefully, you should be able to see that only at high rainfalls, so this part of the graph, and high temperatures do you get really high NPP. So only in this part of the graph where you have high rainfall and high temperature. If rainfall is high but temperatures are low, the NPP is also low, and vice versa. So have a look at this graph, make sure you understand it. Each of those dots represents a community in a certain environmental condition of temperature and rainfall. And this y-axis is how productive they are, how much photosynthesis there is. You will probably remember the slide above from 2003 that I showed you in a previous lecture. This image shows clearly how different factors act to limit productivity in different parts of the globe. It's also true that over the season, different factors act to limit productivity. In our ecosystems, water and temperature are limiting in the winter, but not in the summer. Overall, this global pattern of limiting factors is what results in the global pattern of primary productivity, which is highest in areas with the least limiting factors. So in warm, wet places, like the tropics, you get highest productivity. We've talked about the inputs of carbon or energy to the system, which is photosynthesis. Now we're going to talk about how energy or carbon flows within an ecosystem. You may have seen this slide or a similar one before, because I think both Dara and Jason will have talked to you about trophic webs and trophic pyramids. At the end of this lecture, you need to understand why and how this trophic web forms a pyramid with more biomass or energy at the bottom than at the top. So let's talk it through. It has to do with the efficiency with which different trophic levels consume biomass and convert it into energy for their own uses. Energy always moves up the trophic web from lower to higher trophic levels. At the bottom, you have the primary producers that take energy from sunlight and turn it into carbon. And then the energy and the carbon moves up the trophic web or the pyramid. The one key thing to remember is that only 10% of the energy at one level is available to the next level. So most of the energy, 90% of the energy in the plants doesn't go up to the primary consumers. And that's because most of this energy is used for metabolic processes or released as heat. So that's why you can think of a food web as a pyramid with much more biomass or energy at the bottom and less at the top. This slide gives you more insight into how energy moves through the trophic levels. The graph on the bottom right-hand corner shows how zooplankton production, which is the response variable, the amount of biomass produced, is 1/10 of the phytoplankton production. The phytoplankton production is the predictor variable, so that's on the x-axis. So for every 100 kilojoules of phytoplankton produced, only 10 kilojoules of zooplankton are produced. You can see on this graph, if you have 10,000 kilojoules of phytoplankton, you've got 1,000 kilojoules of zooplankton. 1/10 of the phytoplankton production goes into zooplankton. This diagram demonstrates how energy is lost as it moves up the trophic levels. A lot of it is lost just because it's not consumed. Maybe it's not tasty to the next trophic level. Dead organic matter goes into the decomposer pool. Some is lost as waste material, so fecal matter, and some is lost as respiratory heat loss, so just plants or animals keeping themselves alive, uses energy. The rest, about 10%, is available to move up to the next trophic level. So we've dealt with photosynthesis, carbon uptake by ecosystems, and we've talked about how this energy moves through trophic levels. Now we're going to look at respiration, which is the output, the way that carbon gets lost from ecosystems. And there are 4 main ways that carbon is released from ecosystems. The first one is called photorespiration, and this is the process of photosynthesis. While plants are photosynthesizing, they also end up respiring. You're going to learn about this more if any of you have done plant physiology, or if any of you take my Fundamentals of Ecology course next year, you're going to understand photorespiration is just one of these things that makes plants very inefficient. While they're photosynthesizing, they're also respiring. And then there's this autotrophic respiration, which is basically respiration that the plants need to use energy to keep themselves alive. Just like animals need energy, plants need energy. So they respire some of the energy that they stored just to keep themselves alive, and that releases carbon. Then we have heterotrophic respiration. So that's all the other trophic levels. Microbes, elephants, tigers, humans, they use energy to sustain themselves as well, and they release carbon. So you and I, while you're listening to this lecture, you're breathing in oxygen, you're releasing carbon dioxide. That's heterotrophic respiration, and that's you using up your breakfast or your lunch or your dinner and releasing carbon dioxide. It's also microbes as well. So microbes in the soil decomposing organic matter is also called heterotrophic respiration. And then finally, there's combustion. So that's fire. That's not a biological process at all. That's fire. It can be seen as a particular form of heterotrophic respiration. Because fire acts just like a herbivore, and it consumes plant matter and releases energy. It also releases carbon dioxide and other gases. So when you see the flames of a fire, that's the energy that was stored in the fuel being released. And then when we burn fossil fuels, when we burn oil and coal in our power plants, that's another type of combustion. We're burning plant material that grew a very, very long time ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, and accumulated in the earth as a large carbon stock. And now it's being released through respiration in the form of combustion. And here are just some pretty pictures showing you all the various different ways that energy or carbon is released from terrestrial ecosystems. So the size of these fluxes, the sizes of the different types of respiration, are not the same in different ecosystems. In some ecosystems, most of the energy or carbon is eaten by consumers while it's still alive. So for example, in like a livestock system where you've got lots and lots of cows grazing all the grass, most of the production is eaten by the cows, and then it's respired by the cows. In other ecosystems, most of the energy or carbon turns into dead organic matter and is decomposed by detritivores. So in the boreal forests and things like that, where there's not a lot of edible food, most of the energy or carbon ends up going into the ground. It gets decomposed by microbes. And then, of course, in terms of fire, some ecosystems hardly ever burn, whereas others, like our savanna ecosystems, fire consumes a large amount of the net primary productivity every year. So here's a graph to show you about this. You can see on the y-axis shows different ecosystem types. And then you've got two x-axes. The one shows the percentage of plant production that's consumed by herbivores, and the other one shows the percentage of plant production that's channeled into the dead organic matter compartment. That means decomposition. So forests and shrublands, hardly any of the production is eaten by herbivores. Most of it goes into litter and soil and gets decomposed by microbes. On the other hand, when you've got phytoplankton, most of it gets eaten up by the zooplankton. About half of it, more than half of it, and less than half of it goes into the dead organic matter compartment. And then you have all sorts of ecosystems in between. And those ecosystems vary in terms of how important herbivores are to the respiration flux. I work in grasslands, and you can see in grasslands over here, there is a big range. Some grasslands, wait a minute, so there's a big range in terms of how much is consumed by herbivores versus how much is consumed by detritivores. So some of my work involves trying to understand which grasslands are dominated by herbivory versus fire versus decomposition as the main process of respiration. There are grasslands in Africa where almost all the production is eaten by animals. And there's grasslands in Africa where almost all of the production gets burned by fire. and there are some grasslands where a lot of it goes into the dead organic matter compartment. So I do a lot of work in terms of trying to understand these different fluxes. Now, you know from your soils lecture that there's a whole community of organisms which is specialized for consuming dead organic matter. You've learned about the soil macro and microfauna by Bob, and they are the main decomposers. I'm copying this slide directly from your nitrogen lectures. To understand decomposition in terms of the carbon cycle, you need to think about stoichiometry and C to N ratios. Remember how I said that different plant parts and different plants have very varied C to N ratios. So leaves can have a C to N ratio from 15 to 1, and wood can have a C to N ratio of almost 1,000 to 1. You remember from the slide, the rate at which later decomposes depends on its C to N ratio. And this variation in C to N ratios of the incoming plant litter means that decomposition actually occurs over 3 very different timescales in the soil. So we tend to talk about 3 different soil pools in the soil, and it all depends on what its stoichiometry is, what its C to N ratio is. We talk about the active pool, which consists of tasty leaves and fruit that microbes and fungi decompose quickly. Its mean retention time is about 1 year. So if you put a nice tasty leaf into the soil, within less than a year it'll be decomposed by microbes and fungi. Then we talk about the slow pool. Grass stalks and broad thick leaves, lots of cellulose, and that takes longer. Sometimes it can take up to 10 years to decompose cellulose. Finally, we talk about the passive pool in the soil. The passive pool contains wood and lignin and all sorts of things where the energy or the carbon is difficult for the microbes and fungi to break down because there's just not enough nitrogen to keep them going. So lignin decomposes at takes its mean retention time is 100 years or even more. And then there's some plant material that is almost impossible to break down, and this accumulates in the soil. We can call it labile carbon. You guys also called it humus in your soils lecture. It's very complicated organic carbon molecules that is really hard for organisms to decompose. So this diagram summarizes everything I've told you about. It's a systems diagram that's actually just the fluxes. There's no stocks here. It summarizes all the fluxes of carbon. There is one big input, photosynthesis, which then returns to the atmosphere via 4 main respiration fluxes. There's photorespiration. About 33% of all photosynthesis goes out as photorespiration. Then there's autotrophic respiration. Another 33% of that photosynthesis goes out as autotrophic respiration. Then there's heterotrophic respiration. About 30% of that photosynthesis goes out as heterotrophic respiration. But remember, we talked about how that varies between different ecosystems. And then finally, there's fire. And about 2% of the photosynthesis goes out as fire. Mostly this cycle is pretty closed. Remember we talked about closed and open systems? Almost all of the carbon that comes in goes out again within a few minutes for photorespiration, days to weeks for autotrophic respiration, months to years for heterotrophic respiration and fire. However, a very small proportion, about 1% of what came in the first place, stays in the system and accumulates. Some of this is in plants like trees that live for a long time, but most of this is in the soil, in the bits of dead organic matter, the labile carbon, the humus, that are so hard to decompose that even microbes can't do it. So overall, the carbon system, the carbon cycle, is quite tightly closed, but there's this one little accumulating flux that goes into the system and accumulates carbon in the terrestrial system, and that's the sink of carbon. This just reiterates what I said. These fluxes are almost equal, but not quite. There's this 1% of the original production is stored in the plant carbon, the soil carbon pools, and as coal and as oil. So once you've understood that, once you've understood that this pool of carbon of coal and oil takes a long time to accumulate, then you'll understand what people are doing to the carbon cycle, because the slow pool of carbon is what we are burning for fossil fuel. In the last few hundred years, really, just since the 1700s, we've released carbon that took millions and millions and millions of years to accumulate, and we've released it very quickly. And that's why our atmospheric CO2 concentrations are rising. In this graph, you can see time from 1000 to 2000 BC. Carbon dioxide stayed pretty much the same, and then in the 1700s, when we started to burn fossil fuels, carbon dioxide concentrations increase exponentially. Why is that? Because we're increasing the fluxes of carbon out of the system faster than they can be put back into the system. Now, we learned in the lecture about energetics what happens to this carbon dioxide when it is in the atmosphere and how it can alter the radiation budget of the Earth by warming up the planet. This is just a nice image to show you what a dynamic living place our planet is. We've had a lecture full of graphs. I think I must have given you at least 4 or 5 graphs in this lecture, and I suggest that you go back and look at each one and make sure that you understand what this graph is. Make sure that you understand what the predictor variables are, the x-axis, and what the response variable is. This graph also has 3 axes. We've got latitude going down here. Let me just draw with my little pen. Latitude. So that's where on the Earth you are, from the North Pole to the South Pole. And then we've got year, so we've got time on this axis. And then our response variable is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And so what this graph represents is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere over time across different latitudes. When carbon dioxide goes down, that is actually the planet breathing in, photosynthesizing. When the planet photosynthesizes, when plants photosynthesize, they breathe in. They suck up the carbon from the atmosphere. And when the graph goes up again, that's the planet breathing out, respiring and decomposing. Now, this graph is quite an interesting shape. You get much bigger breaths in the northern hemisphere than you do in the southern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere breathes in and breathes out, whereas the southern hemisphere has much smaller breathes in and breathes out. Now, why is that? That's really just because the northern hemisphere has more land and it has more plants. So the fluxes in and out are higher in the northern hemisphere just because there's more plant material. So I hope that this graph gives you a sense of our living planet, how our planet breathes in and out, just like we as humans breathe in and out, and how that represents big important fluxes in the carbon cycle. Right, what do I want you to take away from this lecture? I think you need to be able to describe how solar energy is converted into stored chemical energy in the form of carbon, which is then cycled through ecosystems. You also need to explain why there is so much energy lost as one moves up trophic levels. So you remember that graph where I showed you how the energy that gets stored by plants gets lost in all sorts of ways before it goes up to the next trophic level. And that's why we have a food pyramid or a trophic pyramid. You need to be able to list all the stocks or pools and all the fluxes or flows of carbon in the terrestrial carbon cycle. And you need to be able to define to me something that's a sink and something that's a source. You also need to be able to explain what controls productivity. Remember, we talked about how in order to have productivity, you need to have water and you need to have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if you have more water, you have more productivity. If you have more carbon dioxide, you have more productivity. You also need appropriate temperatures, you need nutrients. Go back and look at that slide. And you need to be able to explain how this results in global patterns of productivity. So that was the next slide where I mapped out for you which parts of the world are very productive and which parts of the world are less productive. Then you need to list all of the ways that energy or carbon is released from an ecosystem. Remember, I defined 4 different ways that energy and carbon are released. And finally, you need to discuss the difficulties of how to decompose dead organic matter. So we talked about how dead organic matter, the stoichiometry of the dead organic matter, limits how quickly it can be decomposed and how this results in different pools of carbon in the soil, the active pool, the passive pool, and the slow pool. So it was quite a big lecture, Go back and have a look at the bits that you don't understand and do the quiz to see whether you're on top of all of the basic ideas. Great, thanks. This lecture ties up our biogeochemistry section. Next week, we're going to start looking at biodiversity. So try to get up to date over the weekend, and we'll start something new on Monday. If you want some extra reading, then chapter 11 in the Townsend book is great, and you can get that online. You can get it through the library.